Welcome to the webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Yoon Kim. I'm the principal of Silicon Valley Korean School. Actually, we have been hosting teachers' webinars since 2019 with the support of the Consulate General of the Republic of Korea in San Francisco. And before that, we have had teachers' seminars in person for the local educators for over 10 years. So this webinar will provide you many resources and perspectives on Korean students you might have in your class. So I'm very excited to hear the stories from the panelists today. Please enjoy the webinar and leave a message if you have any questions. Also, please take a post survey for your feedback. So we'll send you a gift card for taking post survey. Okay, lastly, special thanks to Rosa Kim, the trustee at Freeman Union High School District. She organized this webinar beautifully. Thank you so much. So now I'm going to pass it over to Rosa, and she's going to introduce a moderator and panelists. Thank you. 감사합니다.
Thank you, Young-soo. Hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank everyone who joined us today for this meaningful discussion. I'm very honored to introduce our wonderful moderator and panelists. Dr. Jeff Kim will moderate today's panel discussion. Dr. Kim has been working in schools for the past 19 years and has served in many roles, including induction support provider, department chair, administration, instruction coach, and civic lead. He is currently teaching in the Anaheim Union High School District at South Junior High School and the online Cambridge Virtual Academy as a history teacher. Dr. Kim also serves as part-time lecturer at Cal State University, Fulton, where he's training the next generation teachers. Next, I will introduce our panelists in alphabetical order. First panelist, Edwin Chang, joined Pixar Animation Studios in 2005, has since worked as a technical director on several Academy Award-winning films such as Up, Inside Out, and Coco. Mr. Jung wrote and directed Wind, which is part of Pixar's Spark Shorts program and is currently streaming on Disney+. Our next panelist, Yoon Choi, is a writer whose work has appeared in New England Review, Michigan Quarterly Review, and Best American Short Stories 2018. Her debut story collection, Skinship, was awarded the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize and a gold medalist for the California Book Awards. It was named one of the best books of the year by NPR, Kirkus Review, and for Fresh Air, and has been recognized by Oprah Daily and the New York Times. Last but not least, E.J. Ko is the author of the memoir, The Magical Language of Others, Washington State Book Award winner, Pacific Northwest Book Award winner, Association of Asian American Studies Book Award winner, and a Penn Open Book Award long list. Ms. Ko is the author of the poetry collection, A Lesser Love, Claire is the editor prize for the poetry winner. Thank you so much for our moderator, Dr. Jeff, and our wonderful panelists. Dr. Jeff, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Trustee Rosa Kim. And I just appreciate you, Trustee Rosa Kim, and Principal Young-soo Kim for your leadership in this area. When the Korean American Ethnic Studies curriculum was first adopted by the state of California, you were among the first to have a panel discussion on this topic, inviting the authors of the Ethnic Studies curriculum to join your panel last year. So what a special treat today, 1 year later. Now we're inviting Korean American authors, writers, and directors who are shaping literature and media in the United States. So before the panelists introduce themselves, I want to share the format of today's panel discussions. We will have 3 rounds. Each round will be approximately 20 minutes in length, and each presenter will have about 5 to 6 minutes to share out. We're going to begin by talking about the personal journey, moving on to the work, and then finally, cultural identity. We'll also have a time for a Q&A session. So please write questions in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat, writing those questions down, and we'll have a Q&A session at the very end. So let's go ahead and begin with round 1 at this time, which is going to give our authors and directors the opportunity to tell us a little bit about themselves, because we're curious about them. So if you could tell us briefly, if there was a moment where you knew you wanted to be an author or director, and if there was a significant event in your life that changed your trajectory from one to another. We're going to begin with Edwin Chang and then move to Yoon Choi and then EJ Ko. About 5 minutes per panelist, please. Edwin Chang.
Just want to say hi, introduce myself. Yep, I'm Edwin Chang. And as mentioned before, I've been at Pixar almost 18 years now, and I've done lots of different roles there, but probably the one I'm most well known for outside of Pixar is having directed the short film Wind. And as for myself, animation, particularly computer animation, is something I'd always been interested in from a really young age. I think from middle school, I knew already that that's something I was really interested in, wanted to get into. The title or position of director is not really something I pursued specifically. I think as a kid, I just really loved animation, and I have posters from a lot of my influences from those days, like the Batman animated series, Calvin and Hobbes comics, certainly lots and lots of anime too. And when I tell people my story of how I kind of ended up Pixar and even ended up directing, in some ways I'm a little hesitant because I think depending on the audience, you can end up at very different conclusions from my story. And so to start with, yeah, in middle school, I was very much interested in animation and technology and computers, and that was my passion, what drove a lot of my interests and studies. And at the time, for my parents, they kind of found it interesting and curious and supported me, and even sending me to like schools and animation programs over the summer. But there was also a bit of wariness on their part too, particularly on my mother's side, because she had also been interested in the arts and ended up, I think both of them being very practical, ended up both entering medicine and becoming doctors. And she had seen how much of a struggle it had been for her friends who remained in art to find work and jobs after that. And so as I got older and more deep into these interests, and finally reached the point where I was like telling my parents, I really want to go to art school. That was the point where they kind of put down the brakes and they're like, okay, wait, now that's a little too far. Like we supported this as a hobby or as an interest, but when we're talking about like a lifelong career choice, we're going to have to kind of discuss a bit more. And especially at the time in sort of the late 90s, animation had kind of had its heyday with, you know, all the Disney films like Lion King, Aladdin, all those, but it had kind of, like many industries and many times animation, kind of come down after that. And Disney was actually struggling and shutting down some of its animation terms. So the industry wasn't looking very healthy. But more than that in particular, they just didn't really see something in a career in the arts as being very stable or sustaining. And so I had these dreams as a very passionate young person in high school of pursuing this, but then my parents said basically, no, you're not going to art school. And as this passionate young high school teenager, I was crushed and heartbroken. Like, how dare you suppress my dreams when every movie I've seen says you should follow your dreams at all costs. And I was kind of found an alternative. I ended up going to Brown University, which is a great school, but actually not at all to go to Brown. I actually tried to go to Brown because there's an art school next door called RISD, Rhode Island School of Design. And so my plan was like, I'll go to Brown, but I'll just like cross enroll and take as many classes as I can at RISD instead. And that was my plan. And I got to Brown. I was like, I'll major in film. But then I realized I hadn't really done my research because Brown actually didn't have a film program. And actually taking classes at RISD was a lot trickier than they kind of made it seem. But while I was at Brown, I ended up finding computer science and computer graphics, which fit well with sort of my background and interests as well, and ended up leveraging that to eventually just loved all the science and technology and the art behind there, which ended up ending into the internship at Pixar, where I've been since for 18 years. And along the way, worked on lots of really cool projects, feature films, theme park rides, and also finding friends that we just liked making short films together with live action just for fun on the weekends. And kind of when the opportunities came up at Pixar, I would just try and pitch ideas, try and learn more about filmmaking and storytelling. And that kind of ended up cascading to this position of getting to actually direct Pixar. And so when I say this, I say I'm hesitant because I think from some perspectives, it's like, oh, great, you have this passion and you kind of ended up going there. And then I think to others, it might be, your parents were right. You should just listen to your parents and do what they say. And I'm like, that's it's not quite the story or moral of it either, but I think there's lots of different perspectives to take on it as well.
Thank you so much for sharing, Edwin, and for pursuing your passion. We are learning so much from you already. Let's now move to Yoon Choi. Yoon Choi at this time.
So I was born in Korea, but I came to America when I was 3 years old. And if I look back on my trajectory and what brought me here to be a writer, I think it was a number of things which were not as straightforward as Edwin's journey. I think Edwin knew he had a passion that he was willing to fight for, but I read a lot. You know, I came to this country and I read a lot because we were not allowed to have a TV. So we read everything. We read like the back of the cereal box, or we read like the Toyota manual. Like there was just nothing else to do. So we read. And then when I went to college in Johns Hopkins, and I entered there also as a reader. I wanted to major in English, but one of the foundational courses you have to take as an English major, like I forget the exact name of the course, but it's something like Intro to Critical Theory or something like that. And I walked into that class, and then I walked out of that class, and I was like, I'm switching my major, because the analytics of it was not really the reason that I loved reading. Hopkins happens to have one of the few writing majors, creative writing majors among the universities. And I didn't know that going in, but it was easy enough for me to switch from reading to writing. My parents didn't know the difference. And so long as it was institutionalized, it felt comfortable. So I did my BA at Hopkins. I stayed and I did an MA at the time. It turned into an MFA a few years after I graduated, but I did my MA at Hopkins as well. And then I was left with this degree and I didn't know what to do. So I went to law school. I went to law school for 1 month and then I left. I went to Korea and I taught English for a while. You know, I was just kind of like trying to figure out what it was that I wanted to do. But I think throughout that time, I didn't stop reading or writing. It's not something that's difficult to maintain on the side. So the real reason I left law school, like I was in California and I moved back to New York. I was in law school for a month, and then I moved back because my boyfriend was there and I married him. And after my husband and I got married, we had 4 kids in 5 years. So that's during that period of time, I completely stopped reading or writing. When I first began writing again, after my 4th kid was born, and I think I'll go into this a little bit later, because Jeff, I think it fits one of your topics later, but the content of my writing had changed. I think that moment when I returned to writing after so many years is when I felt I had found my topics or my subject. There was a very big difference between who I was at 22 and many years later when I started writing. So, you know, that's my trajectory. It's a lot of coincidence and luck. Yeah.
Wow, what a powerful story of just nurturing that reading and writing through the years and never giving up on that story of resilience for sure. Let's pass the baton now to EJ Ko at this time. EJ Ko.
Thank you. Hi, I'm EJ. I'm a poet and translator, and I accidentally wrote a memoir. But I'm also a PhD candidate studying Korean American literature, history, and film at the University of Washington. And I'm sure I will finish my dissertation one day, probably not for a while though. I have one moment really, I think, that shifted things for me. And it was, I was born and raised in the States, but when I was 14, my father got a job offer for a company in Seoul, and he took it, and him and my mother moved to South Korea the next year, and leaving me behind with my brother, who was 4 years older. We were teenagers. They moved us from the Bay to Davis, California, and we were supposed to be apart and live that way for about 3 years, but it became 5 years, 7 years, and 9 years before I would reunite with my family again. But in that time, there was quite a bit of grief and a lot of self-harm. So by the time I miraculously, despite skipping all my classes, I miraculously got out of high school okay. And despite all the learning disabilities, I got into college and I moved to Southern California, where I became a hip hop dancer. I became a competitive hip hop dancer, and that's where I grew up. And also those were the years where that was really popular and it was getting big in America's Best Dance Crew and whatnot. So that was really my goal. And I just want to get out of college as soon as possible. Otherwise I would just be kicked out. And I remember I had one breath requirement left, and it was for math. And I was really, really bad at math. And so my school counselor said, okay, let's do this. We will supplement your math requirement for one poetry class, intro to poetry, and we'll call it a day. And I said, okay, I'm going to go into this poetry class with headphones in and, just acting terribly to my teachers, which was something I often did. Sorry to the educators, everyone here. But it ends in a happy note. I took that first poetry class. I walked in the first day. I heard what I did about poetry and poems, and I left for a week and decided not to come back. But the next week I did come back, and I had a file full of 40 poems that I'd written. So it radically changed. I sort of stopped dancing at that point. I shifted over, and my teachers took me in. They said, you really have something to say here. And they shifted my major in the last year of my undergrad. I took the summer classes and I took all the courses I could to learn what writing is, what poetry is. And that's where it began, I think.
Thank you so much, EJ, for sharing your story. I'm just reminded of just this one word, resilience, when I hear your story. When I read your book, I thought about generational resilience in your story as well. And I know we're recording this as well. So educators out there, I bet if you have a student in your class, a Korean American student, Asian American student, or any student in your class, if they were to hear these authors and directors, and this is being recorded, they would love to, I bet, hear just even this, their story. It could be at the end of the period, just 5 minutes, one story a day, I don't know, but there's more to our panel discussion today. But even already, boom, stories of bravery, stories of daring, stories of resilience already. I hope you in your minds are thinking, how can I integrate this into the classroom setting? But we're going to go ahead and now move to round two, which is a work-related question. Very curious about this. So I'm going to just share a couple of questions, panelists. I want you to just respond to whatever you're resonating with, whatever you feel passionate about. So there's a couple of questions I will share, but if there's something that's connecting to your heart, you're like, I want to share this in this space right now, go with that. So each of you have done some wonderful work throughout your careers. Can you share with us some of the work that you have had the opportunity to be a part of, and what have you been most proud of? Okay, that's one possible topic. Were there moments where you could share your Korean American story through your work? And is there something that you're currently working on that you're excited about that you want to tell us more about right now? So whichever ones that you want to respond to, all of them, one of them, once again, about 6 minutes per presenter. This time we'll begin with Ms. Yoon Choi.
So because my book is about Korean Americans and Koreans and Korean immigrants, kind of that spectrum, I think the subject matter is first and foremost as you approach the book. In terms of things that I'm most proud of, I don't know if pride is exactly the right word, but I had the privilege of participating in a number of class sessions where students were reading my work and, we were discussing it as a kind of guest lecturer. And, beyond like all the other things that somebody might say to you about your craft or, a review that you might get, like I remember one girl telling me, she was a Stanford student, and she's like, I read your story and I called my mom and I said, I love you. And I was like, that's the reason that I guess that's the kind of input that somebody can have when you personally resonate with a person's particular story. And I saw that as a moment where, I don't know, EJ, if you feel this way, but I think writers tend to think of the craft of writing in one way. And I think that I had a tendency to think of cultural issues in a kind of different box. But I saw the value at that moment of seeing somebody or reading about somebody who is similar to you and how that can have a very personal effect. And I found that very moving. And so, yeah, yeah. I forgot your other questions. If my time's going, yeah, what?
That was just so powerful, that reaction and that you saw from another individual and how that really blessed you. And I think we need more of that harmony in our country, generational harmony. And if our stories can bring about closeness between different generations, that's a real blessing for our entire country. There are some additional, I'm going to go ahead and read a couple more questions and you let me know if you'd like to respond to one, or I could pass the baton as well. Were there moments where you could share your Korean American story through your work? Is there something that you're currently working on right now that you're really excited about that you want to share with the group?
So I don't know if I'm ever super excited when I'm in the middle of writing anything. I'm usually pretty frustrated. But I am hoping to do in my next project a pretty deep dive into the psyche of a Korean American young woman. And I personally find that exciting. I think in American literature, we definitely have examples of like, books that are like 800 pages long about the psyche of, the Pennsylvania white man who is selling cars or, at different points in time. And I just think having written short stories, like kind of going much more in depth into the mindset, into the influences of a young Korean American woman is an exciting challenge for me.
I think that's so wonderful. I was just speaking to this group just a little bit earlier, how I never had a teacher that looked like me in all my K through 12 education, but that also includes authors, people on television, and so forth. So thank you for delving into and discovering these identities and giving so many an opportunity, not just to see Korean American identity, but American identity, but also that Korean American identity. So that's so beautiful. I'm going to pass the baton now to EJ Ko.
Thank you for sharing that, Yoon, and thank you, Dr. Jeff, for giving us a peek at your process too along the way. I'm pretty happy about working on a Pachinko, the television series for Apple TV. I got to write episode 4, and that was really close to my heart because I got to share the story of, my grandmother being born and raised in Japan and finding out she was Korean when she was 19 and then escaping with her parents back to Jeju Island. And I got to sort of bring in stories about, in Western popular culture, they're like sea women, but really it's Haenyeo, and the Jeju massacre is something I've written about and something I wanted to sort of allude to, but the same as the Kanto massacre, which My grandmother survived, and her parents survived by passing a language test, actually, so that they could pass as Japanese when there was the massacre, the Kanto massacre happening after the earthquake, which blamed Koreans. And same with my grandmother's father, unfortunately, didn't survive the Jeju massacre. He was stoned to death in a demonstration, and it created a rift between my grandmother and her mother, and that becomes one of the big chapters that I write about. But bringing those stories kind of to something as big as this television show that is sort of international, and bringing those stories face forward, I think was really important. And right now, I'm looking forward to finishing up my novel. It's my debut novel. It'll be out fall 2023 if I'm pretty lucky, but it's called The Liberators, and it's going to go a little deeper into the stories I'd started out with in my memoir. But I would say it's generally about the Korean American imaginings of the North and South. I think the DMZ feels like a stitch across my body. It feels like a divide. It feels like a border. It feels like something I go toward. And so that's something I want to keep thinking about, and thinking about how to hold stories of intense trauma and generational trauma and grief, and how you come out of that with a sense that things can be different, a sense of hope.
Wow, that's so beautifully stated. We've all heard about the Hallyu movement, K-pop, K-drama, K-beauty products, K-food, but I don't think what a lot of people have heard about is what you're talking about, EJ, K-resilience, and this ability to see this story of resilience in Korean American and Korean history, whether it's the colonization period you're talking about between 1910 to 1945, or the Korean War between 1950 to 1953, both traumatic experiences for the country, for individuals, but then even the miracle on the Han, the challenges for the young people there, and then of course the migration story to the United States. All this so difficult, but then when processed, and processed in a good way, can lead to a kind of resilience. And you're taking us there to those painful parts, but giving us a moment to kind of pause and think and reflect. Takes a lot of courage to go there, I think, which is why I think we don't hear about K-resilience enough, I feel. So thank you for sharing that. Let's now pass the baton to Edwin Chang. Edwin Chang, please. Edwin, I'm not sure I hear the audio.
Thanks. I was saying, having worked at a larger name studio for such a long time, there's lots of projects, lots of films that I've worked on that I've been really proud to be part of. But I think, like Yoon was saying, I'm not sure pride is the right word, but definitely value the experiences and contributions I was able to make to those films and get them done. And certainly Wind is the one that I was most personally invested in, just being inspired by my grandmother, my family's own story, and also being able to share sort of the themes, be it metaphorically, of the Korean War and the Korean diaspora. And so, yeah, and making those, I think in the process of making Wind, it wasn't necessarily about trying to make a Korean American story or a Korean story, just more of a personal family story, specific in that way. And I think being able to share it and see people's reactions is also very similar to what Yoon was saying, in that a lot of the work I do, I hope, serves as a process of connecting with people. And I think especially for immigrants and children of immigrants, there's definitely a certain sense of loneliness or disconnection from society at large. So when you can find these elements in stories like the ones that Yoon and EJ have written as well, there's such a moment of recognition, not only in yourself, but in others, and realizing you're not alone. And it's those moments that I've really valued in hoping and being able to create, and also experiencing in so many other people's work. And yeah, I can only hope to continue to try and contribute towards those kinds of stories going forward. The project I'm currently working on at Pixar is not in directorial role, it's in another more technical role, but it's a series for Disney Plus, our first original series for Disney Plus called Win or Lose. That'll be coming out in fall of 2023. And it's hard to describe, but it centers around a softball team sort of in America, but it follows each of the characters on that team and their stories on the field and also at home and with their families. And it's probably one of the most not only diverse, but also meaningful stories that I've seen Pixar tell. And I think that's in a gamut of very meaningful stories that we've told before. So I'm really excited to be working on that and be able to hopefully share with that people in the future.
Well, we're hearing so many stories about Korean resilience that can also shape Korean Americans, not just Korean Americans, but all Americans, because I think that those themes of conflict, generational differences, trauma, war, borders, right? Families being separated. These are all very powerful stories that are not only in the Korean community, the Korean American community, but definitely in so many families in the United States as well. And the sense of identity and strength that you could find in your stories, so adaptable to stories outside of the Korean American community as well. Connecting with people, as you mentioned, Edwin. So thank you so much for sharing a little bit about your the work that you guys are working on and how much you value it and the values that you have. I think this kind of moves us to round three of the questions, which revolves around cultural identity now. And what's so profound is that each of you have created art or literature that reflects or is an expression of your own cultural identity, your Korean American identity. It's seen as an asset, it's seen as a strength because you knew these stories. Could you share how knowing your story has helped you in your work? And we also have educators in the audience as well. In what ways do you feel educators can encourage their own students to know and tell their story, but maybe even more importantly, find their voice to tell it? Because I bet it took quite a bit for you to all find your voice to tell it. So if you could say something to a teacher, going back to that young girl, young boy that you were, a teacher that could have said something to you at a young age to find your voice, to tell your story at a young age, what advice would you give to that teacher of your younger self? And then once again, that first question was, could you share how knowing your story has helped you in your work? I'm going to pass the baton to EJ Ko this time. EJ Ko.
Thank you. Thank you for these incredibly easy questions. No, I'm just kidding. It's wonderful. I'm looking forward to this. I might flip it on you a little bit, is that one of my teachers taught me something that helped me figure out the rest of my story. And that might be more sufficient in that case. It was that first, going back to the first poetry class, I'd written the poems. They're all about my mom. And I bring them in to show my teacher. And I remember him saying that I really know how to start a poem. I know how to generate a poem and I know how to fill in the middle, but I don't know how to write the turn. And the turn is the last line or the last two lines. And I couldn't figure out what he meant by that. And he said, it's because your writing is missing magnanimity. And I had never heard of that word before that day, or let alone read a poem before. And the way I was explained the term magnanimity was, when I'm writing a poem about my mother, by the end of the poem, I have to forgive my mother, or the poem has to forgive me for not. And that is magnanimity. It's the ability to hold both sort of intense anger and sadness alongside a love and a humility, to be able to see beyond what I'm capable of seeing at this moment. A poem without magnanimity would just be a diary entry, a journal. It would be any other piece of writing, but it wouldn't be a poem. And so that I really took that one lesson and I sort of amplified it hundreds of times, not just through poems, but my memories, the way I recall, the way I build my relationships with people, the way I translate, the way I structure, a long form fiction or nonfiction. It was trying to sort of roll things out constantly with the sense of magnanimity in mind. And I think it taught me how to pay attention. It taught me how to care. And it seems trite, but I don't think those were things I'd done before or wanted to do or tried to do. But once I was shown how to do it, it's like I couldn't stop.
Can you tell us a little bit about the strategy that your teacher used to help? That's so complex, talking about side by side, intense anger with sadness alongside love. How do you process all that? How did you process that? How did your teacher help you to process that?
I think the ability to hold multiplicity, and I could say those terms now because I know them, but at the time, or especially if in the case when I think back to those scenes that I'm writing about where I'm in high school, I didn't have those words. I didn't have the word for bulimia, alcoholism, racism, abuse, like self-harm. I didn't know those things. But what's incredible is when I write about those scenes, I still remember them very well and I could describe them so well. And so I guess I'm going a little off topic here, but the reason I love like another writer, Maya Angelou, so much is because she gives children, the characters of children in her stories, a maturity. It's just because they don't know or have the name for something doesn't mean they're not capable of having very complex, mature feelings and a really complicated ways of understanding what's going on between an adult and a child. And so I think my teachers, many of my teachers, there's a lot of teachers that I write about, but they took me in and they asked me to notice things every day. They asked me to pay attention to things. They showed me stories and asked what I thought of a certain thing. It seems quite simple, but yeah.
Now that you mentioned Maya Angelou, I love her quote where she says, do the best until you know better. And when you know better, do better. And I'm thinking that for our educators, just like, how do we support our students in engaging in this space where they can discover themselves? They say writing is generative, where in the act of writing itself, there's so much learning that's happening. And then the teacher that is noticing the things that the students are writing and encourage more sharing, more dialogue. I know Brian on from our audience was asking, how does affirmation play into the craft? How did the teacher's affirmation of you help you to further develop your craft?
Is that a question to me? Or
yes,
to me.
To you. And I just want to let you guys know on time, we are in round 3, but we're actually a little bit faster than we are. So we have room to talk and dialogue. And I just want you to know that. So if you want to expand and expound a little bit more, I know you guys are so respectful of one another. We do have that space, just to let you know.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I try to think about how difficult it would have been to approach a student like me living in the situation I was in, which was pretty illegal, and I wasn't taking care of myself or coming to school. And on the outside, you really can't say anything because it would sort of put me in danger to sort of try and come into the family or say that there's something wrong with this kid's family situation and whatnot. And so mostly I think I was ignored, but I remember there was one teacher, I think she said it, my first year I'd moved to Davis, I was 15 and a half or something, and just a terrible state, drinking drugs, attempted suicide several times at that point. But I came into class and it was a literature class, actually, surprising to me now. And she said like one nice thing to me. And I don't remember what she said. That's the thing. I remember the feeling of it though. And I remember feeling that that was the one nice thing I'd heard from anybody, from my brother, from my family, I talked about this hundreds of times, but I still get choked up, but something so small can really be held on to for years, I think. And it did get me through high school, surprisingly, until I met my poetry teachers who saw something in me that I couldn't see myself, and took a lot of convincing otherwise. But I think once I turned my mind around, it was all in.
Wow, that's really powerful, educators. One nice thing. We've all heard that students don't care how much we know as teachers until they first know how much we care. And it doesn't take a lot, sometimes just one nice thing. And E.J. Ko is reminding us, sometimes when people look at Asian Americans, they think model minority, right? And on the outside could seem like a model minority, but man, there's so much brokenness and pain that I think is in our community that we have not had the chance to talk about enough. I remember being a part of this father school, and a bunch of men were there, and we're talking about being fathers, and we're talking about our relationship with our fathers. And so many very strong men there were just breaking down and crying because of these broken relationships. And so I think even though we talk about oftentimes Asian Americans as a model minority, it's really a model minority myth. There's all this pain that's there. And thank you, EJ, for being one of the folks to be vulnerable enough and courageous enough to reveal some of these stories so that we can meet the needs of our students. I'm going to pass the baton now to Edwin Chang. Edwin Chang.
Yeah, thank you for speaking so beautifully, EJ. It definitely arose a lot of thoughts and memories in me as well. And just to build off of that, I think also for actually, I think teenagers and actually everyone in general, it can be so hard to know where you stand or where you value yourself or how others value you. And I think particularly for immigrants and children of immigrants, because you feel in kind of such a lost space where it's a new culture, a new society you're unfamiliar with, it becomes a very easy tendency to, since you're floating in space, the only real point of reference you have is to compare yourself with others. And I think that drives in turn a lot of the competition and also self-competition we have with each other. And I think words of affirmation or the role of teachers can be that more objective point of reference or framework where people can realize that it's not just about comparing yourself with others and how you're doing with others, but this person outside of me is also saying kind things to me, and holding on to that as more of a bedrock, as opposed to just kind of freewheeling and running as hard as you can, I think is something that is something that we could all be much healthier about. And I think an important role teachers can play in doing that. Yeah, and I guess just returning to your earlier question about how my Korean American identity has kind of pulled into my own work. Storytelling was once described to me as, probably more eloquently than this, but as a way of finding meaning in a series of random events. And I think looking at my own family history and kind of seeing the tragedy there, but then turning that and translating that into stories of sacrifice and of love, I think was a big component in understanding that and finding the meaning in things that had happened there in myself and my family as well. And as part of that, it wasn't necessarily something that was Korean American, though our Korean history is filled with so much tragedy. But yeah, I think just putting that out there and then being able to connect with others is a way you find out more about yourself. Really, storytelling is a way of not just creating meaning, but finding meaning and realizing sort of the values you hold in yourself and the way you interpret the world and putting in this outside story.
I love how you talk about Edwin connecting with others. I know when it comes to common stereotypes of Asians and Asian Americans in this country, here in Orange County, in fact, there's a 1,800% increase in anti-Asian racism and hate incidents. Just here in Orange County, where there's so many Asian Americans, oftentimes they say it's these stereotypes, this idea of the model minority myth or persistent foreigner, that when they see somebody that's second generation, third generation, they're still seen as a foreigner, or yellow peril. There's something dangerous about that those people coming from that place, right? And this isn't just a recent surge, but really a resurgence going back to even the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? But you talk about connections, Edwin. How through your stories can you build these connections so that people are not feeling like, oh, that's them, that's the other? How are you bridging and creating these connections so there's compassion and love for one another?
Yeah, so when I was making Wind, and I think in all the stories Pixar tries to tell us, we try and be as specific as possible, be it in the character designs or the stories or the character traits, to really create a sense of texture and reality behind these worlds and characters. And so in my case, I pulled a lot from my own family and my grandmother. And part of that is to avoid a sense of genericness that can come sometimes when you're trying to create something for a larger audience. And that sense of specificity creates a lot of authenticity. But then there's also a fear that by being too specific, you might end up alienating parts of the audience as well. Unfortunately, the environment I was given to make Wind was kind of a smaller program where we had the freedom to be as specific as we want. But even so, it kind of became a question like, oh, how Korean do you want your film to be? Which even while that was never explicitly said, it kind of felt like an undercurrent, and not sure I was one that I was quite how to address. And so part of it was like, oh, should I have more hanboks in it? Or should I have other things like that? But that didn't really fit into the story very well, or that world very well. And so I created something that I felt was more magical, but also more meaningful and more truthful, I guess, to the story that I was looking to tell. And so when the film came out and I was reading people's reactions, I was really happy to hear that it wasn't just something that people saw as a Korean story, but really something that a wider group of people could relate to. And it was much more about their own parents and their grandparents that they were able to connect with. And I think by being specific, it created something that people could, actually connect to and believe in, even though it necessarily wasn't the same image that they had in their mind, but it was still something to connect with. And by still having those specificities they saw there, they could still see that, that core of the story was still there. And even though the skin of it might look different from what they were seeing, that same core story is shared among people who might look differently from them as well. And so part of my hope was that when this film came out, and one of the reasons we released it openly on YouTube, sort of in the midst of all these current attacks on Asian Americans, particularly against the elderly, was just that, like, hopefully people will see this. And now hopefully going forward, when they see someone on the street, it's not, oh, it's that old Asian lady. It's more, oh, that's grandma, or something along those lines.
Wow. Oh, that's grandma. I love that. And this kind of reminds me a little bit what Nancy Newkirk is saying in the chat. She's saying the K wave has been such a powerful and popular voice in America recently, but is there a missing KA wave, Korean American wave? And I would say to that, I don't think so, because we got EJ, Ko, we got Yoon Choi, Edwin Chang leading this KA wave that's up and coming, and many more. As educators like yourself, give that magnanimity and give those opportunities in those spaces like EJ was talking about for our students. I'm sure we're going to have a much more powerful KA wave coming forward as well, which integrates, of course, aspects of the K wave too. Let's pass the baton now to Yoon Choi. Yoon Choi.
Yeah, EJ and Edwin, I loved hearing what you had to say, and particularly I loved hearing the craft terms about the turn in the poem, or the specificity that you look for in a Pixar film, which is truly universal. I do think that there is something in that very specific rendering that makes a character somehow more relatable and in a paradoxical way. When you talk about this Korean American wave, I don't know that I would call it a wave, but I definitely think that there's been huge progress, not just for Korean Americans, but just in terms of openness towards all different kinds of voices, that I think at this juncture, it's almost hard for me to imagine, but it wasn't there when I started writing. To the extent that, looking back at my, 19, 20, 21-year-old self, the idea that you would choose to write Korean stories or Korean American stories was very much to put yourself in a pigeonhole, to be considered an ethnic writer rather than one of American writers. And that was a pigeonhole that I really didn't want to be in. And so, I remember looking up, like in phone book, the last names that are generically American, because I didn't want to give my character a name like Kim, because immediately I felt like that was going to create a certain expectation of my story. Or I would just kind of do nameless narration or give somebody just a generic name like Anne. And at that time, I found it really, really hard to finish my stories. They were very short. So if anyone's looked at my book, my stories are actually extremely long. They're like really pushing the definition of a short story. But at that time, when I was writing, this was when I was newly in that MA program, I just couldn't finish. Like I barely made the 50-page thesis cutoff to pass my program. And I think it was because it wasn't legitimate to me to explore those things that I knew most deeply. And so I was trying to imitate the voices that I'd heard. So, I was trying to sound like Chekhov or Tolstoy or John Updike or, all the different writers that I had grown up reading. For me, like a profound shift happened after I had my kids. And, one night I was like, okay, I'm going to start writing again. My youngest was 1 year old. And the character that I came up with at that time had a name, and his name was Han Mose. And that was the first time I had deliberately written about a Korean character. And I was like, I'm just going to get my feet wet. I'm going to just, do a little exercise. Han Mose, he's walking somewhere. He's going to go to the lake. And so I started writing that story. And it turned into like a 40-page story. And that story was my application to my fellowship. And so I think it wasn't just in terms of my own evolution, but also culturally. So many things had happened to, it wasn't just my own courage in being able to try something new, but there are so many other examples of writers who are doing things. I think initially of Chang Rae Lee, but I think of writers also like Junpo Lahiri, who isn't obviously Korean American, but as Edwin was saying, the specificity with which she would write about the Bengali American experience, and then my own reaction to her specificity, feeling that it was not alienating, but it was universal. Like when a character describes using like Rice Krispies to create a kind of, Indian, like a meal that's reminiscent of India. That's not something I personally know, but just like that feeling I had of immigration and understanding and connecting with a different culture made me see opportunities, I think, in writing about the Korean American experience in a way that would have special meaning to Korean Americans, but would also be able to be universally understood. So yeah, looking back, I'm like, why didn't I just call somebody Kim, But it took me many, many years to come to that point.
Oh, Yoon, thank you for just inviting us in, because we're just seeing the end product and not the journey. So we're really getting the story today, this evolution of your identity as a writer, how it kind of began maybe with a little bit of imitation, but then you started to find your voice and you saw the worth of your own identity, your own culture. These are not just great Korean American stories. These are great American stories, but these are also great Korean American stories. And so I thank you for not only your courage, but your willingness to evolve and change and be vulnerable. And how would you, if you were to, speak to educators, how would you encourage young people to find their identity as writers, to have this evolution, to incorporate aspects of their culture, their language, their experiences, their histories into their own writing at a young age? What would you say to an educator?
So I heard Toni Morrison in an interview once talk about the idea of neutrality, or the fictional idea of neutrality, which many of us buy into, including myself, if I'm not being careful. And so that's the idea. When you see a commercial and there is a Caucasian face in a commercial, we just kind of take it as a matter of course. Or if we're reading a story and there is, a Caucasian protagonist, it's kind of taken as a neutral, non-culturally specific zone. And then other, like a story like mine, would be a more culturally specific story. If I'm talking to a classroom, a question I often get from a student who's usually not a minority student is, are you always going to write stories about Korean Americans? So the question that irritated Toni Morrison was, why do you always write about Black people? Why don't you write like a more neutral, universal story? And her contention was, there is no such thing. No matter what, no matter who is writing, you're always writing out of culture and experience. However much you want to put that in, of course, is your style and your taste and your preference. But we all come from specific places. And so I think for students to kind of understand that and to begin to open their eyes and see that everything around them is just a product of the specificity, as Edwin said, of the person who had created that work, I think takes the burden off of needing to feel so culturally aware when you are creating your work. You're just being yourself. You're just being a writer. You're just finding your voice. And so, I think that if I had known that might have made me think a little bit differently about things.
Wow, you're just being yourself. You're just writing out of culture, as Toni Morrison shared. Wow, that's really powerful. We're going to now move to the final round, which is a Q&A. Really appreciative of Principal Young-Suk and Trustee Rosa, who have already curated some questions from the audience as well. But then we'll also take some from the chat. So it felt like I didn't answer your question, the question was not answered. Feel free, don't be shy about repeating that question or adding that question to the chat. But I'm just going to go ahead and begin with some of the questions that we did have from before. All right, and in this final round, anyone can share out. So whoever has something to say from the heart, just please feel free to share out. There will not be a speaking order for this final round. All right, some of our young students may have doubts about themselves. How did you overcome your doubts and grow in your confidence and your identity as a Korean American?
I can kind of maybe start, and maybe it'll spark some other things, but I grew up in LA and near Koreatown, so a very dense, large Korean community, a very centered amount like Korean American churches, and I kind of had a dual identity in that the schools I went to were more white, but then on weekends when I went to church, it was very much Korean, and that kind of dichotomy created this sense of like me not feeling Korean enough, which I've heard among many Korean Americans. And in particular, my Korean was not very good. And so going to Korean school after church on Sundays was torture. And I felt so out of place and so incapable that I think it created a greater sense of division than being in that community as part of log. And kind of looking back on that, and it was also natural, like that question of like, how Korean are you has come up a lot more than I would ever expect. And I think looking back on that now, I try and think of it as we are also disconnected from each other across cultures, across societies, and that we should really look at things like being Korean as opportunities for connection rather than reasons to find difference between each other. And I think I found that more now, especially in literature, Korean American literature I've read, where I'm like, oh my gosh, this person has had this conversation that I've had a million times with other friends, or there are other stories or identities that I didn't realize that I had so much connection to, people I've never met, but because of this shared background, I no longer feel that sense of loneliness. And I see how other people have gone through so many things. And especially as a teenager, for all teenagers, I think you're always feeling like, oh, no one has ever gone through this before, you know. And as an adult, I can kind of look back at that and laugh, but it's such a source of, I think, struggle as a young person. And so learning to lean on my Korean culture is just another element I can use to connect with other people, I think would have been hugely beneficial, and not using it to exclude. And so the older I got, I think I found that more. I started learning Korean again in college, and even spending much time in Korea trying to get better at Korean. And while I'm still not where I'd like to be, I think that was a big part of sort of rediscovering myself. And something I found also is that being exposed to Korean Americans and also Korean culture, there was this whole landscape of things that I didn't even realize I was so fascinated in. Different versions or different angles of things that I was, like even animation, like realizing there's a whole another Korean animation industry, and seeing that and that being fascinating and wanting to know about that, and having this sort of personal connection more than just what I had with Americans. And that goes to lots of different things. Like I have a friend who is very much interested in tattoos, which was, you know, very, I think, taboo growing up in the Korean American culture. But then she was discovered that there's this whole tattoo subculture in Korea. And like just being able to find this other angle of something you're already fascinated in a different culture, just expands the world you're aware of, and the connections you have with those people there.
What a powerful statement, Edwin, not using culture to exclude, but using culture to include. And we live in a great nation, maybe the most color-blessed nation in the world. And so it's a great opportunity for us to be so inclusive and to be known in the world as so inclusive. It's an opportunity, I don't think we're there, but it creates a kind of opportunity. And so thank you for your work that's allowing us to see that color-blessed aspect of our country. It's a great blessing, not only for our country, but also for our students as well. Would anyone else like to respond to that or add to that, or add to the additional question, which is, has there ever been a situation where you have had an identity conflict between both Korean and American? And how did you manage that conflict? I think Edwin touched on that a little bit. And I think a lot of young people, they're struggling with this. Well, am I Korean? Am I an American? That's the question young people are asking. Who am I? So if there would be a speaker that would like to share on that.
I want to more respond to Edwin and Yoon, just because they've touched on a few things. And then I do want to maybe touch on that, maybe the periphery of that question, not exactly. But when I think of what Edwin is talking about, and thank you, it's so aptly put, it reminds me, it's not just that Koreans are not a monolith, and so that one Korean story represents all Koreans. Like, that's not possible, but it goes for Korean Americans as well. I don't think I've met another Korean American writer who's had the exact same experience as I have. That is certainly not the case. And trying to sort of water that down and categorize it is it sort of debilitates the ability to continue growing those stories, to have as many different kinds of stories as possible, and to embrace like the Korean American adoptee community. And that is another place where it's called a monolith, and it's not. There are no Korean American adoptees that have the same story. It goes for the Korean American LGBTQ community, QIA plus as well. I mean, just so trans-Pacific Korean Americans. I mean, Korean Americans who've done so much work across these genres to make sure that we remember that no matter how specific our experiences are, that's not where we connect. We connect because despite how specific those experiences are, what's universal are the emotions, and the emotions that we have behind those experiences. And so I think I connect to that deeply. And also, Edwin, I keep bouncing off of you because you've such important things. Another thing is should I put a hanbok in there? And I'm so glad you didn't decide to do certain things like that, because I think with the question about the K wave and the Korean American wave, there is an iffy spot that we approach, actually, and that's cultural tourism. At what point are you flashing the kimchi jjigae and the pop? I flash a lot of pop, and the hanboks and the pansori, and you want to use all these words like sonagi. Like, how much are you doing that for cultural tourism for someone who's not Korean, versus doing that because there is a meaning and a story behind it, and it has a purpose and drive, and it's a reflection of another universal emotion. And so I think there are places to be cautious of as we move forward into new stories, new growing and different ways of telling those stories. Something that's helped me with the Korean American side of things is translation. I did my MFA at Columbia, and I was there for poetry, but I added translation because I was in a poetry class with this amazing poet, Eamon Grennan, and he told the class, if you want to write good poetry, if you want to be a good poet, write poetry. If you want to be a great poet, then translate. And I didn't know what that meant exactly, but I knew that I wanted to add translation to understand. And that's when I started picking up Korean again and trying to translate and translate Korean poetry, and then later my mother's letters. But what I've learned was I've always been taught to translate directly from Korean to English, and to make the translation sound seamless so that the English is written as if it was written originally in English. And that was really interesting, because later, as I developed as a translator, I thought that's really interesting, because Korean and English, our tongues point to a country, and those countries have histories, and those histories have relationships with each other. And Korean being a historically non-dominant language with the English, which is like historically dominant language, when I translate the Korean and I erase the trace of Korean, what am I really doing? Am I erasing a part of who I am, a part of the language and culture? How do I keep them both forward? And so that means translating Korean to English in a way that in the English, you can tell it's Korean. You can tell by the rhythms and the sounds. You could tell by the assonance. You can tell by sort of sometimes the way things bend and turn with punctuation that this is Korean. And having the choice to do that, having the ability to say, I decide how much Korean comes in and why it's so important that it stays Korean, is closing the gap between Korean American. For me, it's bridging histories.
Well, it's so powerful, the idea of by being bilingual and bicultural at the same time. EJ, you definitely have that skill and ability. I wish I did, I know that, but that is definitely an asset that you have. And you're able to draw from that asset of being both bilingual and bicultural as well. That kind of leads us to our next question. Do you have a story of a teacher who helped you to have more confidence in being bilingual or bicultural, and see that as an asset as you were growing up?
I thought about this question, and when I had read it in prep, and I actually can't think of anyone. Maybe if someone had said something to me like, why don't you give your character a last name? I might have, reacted differently. But I can think of writers that I read who kind of gave me permission to move forward. And when I don't remember exactly how old I was, but when Chang Rae Lee published Native Speaker, I was gifted that book by my parents. And I think many, many Korean Americans whose parents had never bought a novel were gifted that book at the time. My parents didn't read it, but they just handed it to me to show me, like, here is. And the thing is, I didn't read it. And when I met Chang Rae Lee, I never told him I didn't read it. But the thing that was so interesting to me was like the way his name was spelled on the jacket. Like, Chang Rae Lee is a very difficult name, I think, to understand in English. And there it was on the jacket cover. And I think that experience was seminal for me. The other thing that he had written was an essay, which was turned into a short film. I think, Edwin, you might know, but it was about his mother's stomach cancer and the foods that he would create in trying to replicate his mother's cooking, like the way that she would make kalbi, or the things that he would try to cook. And it was the first time I'd seen Korean cooking depicted in writing, and the pleasure that I took in understanding that the way that she uses her knife to separate the bone from the kalbi was so specific, and it was just something that I understood so well. I think that was also a very formative moment in which I was like, oh, my writing can do that too. Although now there are so many writers who write so well about food, Korean food. But yeah, so I think that for me, those were his book and his essay were two moments that kind of showed me the path forward.
Well, thank you for sharing that story, that you didn't have a lot of experiences where your culture, your language ability was affirmed. I don't think I had too many of those experiences myself. And so I work in a school where there's a lot of actually Latinx students, about 90%. And sometimes we'll have these parent learning walks where the parents will come in. A lot of them are first generation to the United States, and also their children will be first generation college students. So they're coming in, and maybe their educational experiences, they don't 100% feel comfortable, right? But I always try to let them know, hey, if you are speaking Spanish to your kids at home and they're becoming bilingual, bicultural, that's a great asset that you're giving them. You're giving them a wonderful, wonderful gift. And that's a reminder for us educators that we need to do this more. We need to have more of these experiences where our young people are hearing that from us, that the culture, the different cultures, the different languages, whatever language or culture that is being valued and appreciated and seen as an asset in our classrooms, and even opportunity when there's opportunity for work for students to actually work on that. I know I had a chemistry and math teacher that I was teaching with very recently, and they actually were talking about energy exchange. And they looked at ethnic foods and how many calories ethnic foods took, and they incorporated ethnic studies into chemistry and math. So whichever class you're in, certainly in the English language arts or history, we can incorporate these things. But I just gave an example there in chemistry and math, and to provide that. I think a lot of people have not heard that before, as Yoon had just mentioned. One of the most frequently asked questions that we received was this question. And I think you answered it a little bit, Yoon, with the Cheng Rui Lee book, but we have students who are interested in learning more about the Korean American story in English. Do you have any recommendations? Maybe we can hear also films, we can also hear from our authors that you think it would be important for our young people to have a chance to take a look at?
Sure, I can start with a short list. Maybe I'll think of more others, but the first that came to mind is actually Julia Cho. She was actually the screenwriter of Turning Red, which is a film about a Chinese American woman, but I think she pulled a lot from her own experience as a Korean American and her relationships with her parents. But she's actually also a playwright. And so she's written a collection of plays called The Language Archive. And I can put this in the chat if anyone looks her up. The other book that came to mind was one I read, I think last year, by Steph Cha, called Your House Will Pay. It's a book about a Korean American who grew up in LA and dealing with sort of the after effects of the riots and the relationships between Black people and Koreans there. And having grown up in LA and been very young, but also gone through the LA riots, I think it exposed and helped me understand a lot of those things a lot better. And the last thing I wanted to recommend is another books by Min-Jin Lee, the writer of Shinko, and one of the first Korean American books I read was Free Food for Millionaires, which is about a Korean American woman in New York, kind of struggling to figure out herself and her family. And I think reading that was such eye-opening for me, to read these experiences of Korean Americans and finding so much to relate to, and being exposed to sort of so many of the same kind of struggles I had seen, and seen that shared in a way I could relate to.
You know, I think I'm going to open up that question to everyone. I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on this, whether it's a film or a book that you think would be so important and helpful for others who are interested in the Korean American story, but in English.
I have one more that I just thought of and I forgot to mention. There was a feature film called Gook a couple years ago. I'm forgetting the name of the director, but actually I think he's involved in Pachinko, EJ, so you might be able to speak more to this either. But that was also another film about Korean Americans during the LA riots that I found very powerful and would highly recommend.
Yeah, I was gonna mention the Stuffed Child book too. I always wondered, has no one written about the LA riots? And sure enough, Stuffed Child had written Your House Will Pay. Nicole Chung has written a memoir about being an adopted Korean and coming to terms with her Korean heritage. I think the name of that book is All You Can Ever Know. And one more that I can think of, that's not a book, but Eric Kim has lately been writing columns for the New York Times food section, in which he will deconstruct how to make kimchi rice, or, you know, like different, and I think reading his recipes is also fun, and but also enlightening, but also like delicious at the same time.
All right, thank you so much. And I see, Edwin, you've also typed some of those titles in the chat. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And then EJ, your thoughts?
Yeah, I have a couple books. Those are great recs. And it was Justin. Justin was on Gook, I believe. Let's see, the Korean American poetry. I mean, that is, if you want to go where the stories are sort of really pushing against the things that sort of the way we are hurt within and without. I think Korean poetry is just so incredible right now. Dami Che Dami's DMZ colony, talking about the DMZ villages, about the prisoners there, about her father being a photographer during the war, and her going from China to the States here with photographs. So the poetry is sort of doing something interesting with fiction and photography and opera as well. I think Emily Chung Min Yoon's A Cruelty Special to Our Species, that is another poetry book, and it has a way, I mean, it has one poem that I'll never forget. She talks about how people are like trees, and the way we doubt our own ability to be useful even when we are burned down. I mean, some of those lines and ideas are so incredible. They can take up whole books by themselves. In terms of I think translation work is so important to read. So I'm thinking of, it's a collection of short stories by Korean women writers. So it's called The Future of Silence. It was translated, I believe, by Bruce and Ju Chan Fulton, but they translated, the collection of fiction by Korean women. It has like Kim Sa-gwa in it. It has so many of the sort of really big names in Korean women fiction, and it's interesting to go there and read sort of the aesthetics or sort of what's going on in those stories. So, yeah.
Oh, thank you everyone for just sharing your recommendations on texts that have influenced you. I also want to share one with Dr. Ed Chang. He talks about a concise history of Korean Americans. It's 100 pages, but if I were to ask most Americans, could you name one Korean American that has impacted the United States? Just one. They would really struggle. They would really struggle with this. And so when folks don't know Korean American history, Does that mean that there's just a complete absence of knowledge? Not actually, because actually there's actually quite a lot of stereotypes that people think of when they think of an Asian American man or Asian American woman for that matter. And so if they can't even name one American, Korean American that they can respect, I think that makes it very difficult for them to just really value the community and the story. And so, yeah, I thought Dr. Ed Chang's book, A Concise History of Korean Americans, a very, very simple 100-page book on Korean American history. And I see Brian on, you talked about Colonel Young Kim, and he's definitely a part of that as well, leader of the 472nd Regiment, which was made up of Japanese Americans, of children who were interned from in World War II in the United States into incarceration camps. They formed a battalion, and one of their leaders was actually a Korean American by the name of Colonel Young Kim. And when they decided to have him be the leader of that, when they realized he was Korean, and this was during the 1910 to 1945 colonialization of Korea, they said, you know, maybe you don't want to lead this group because they're made up of Japanese. But he said, no, they're Americans. I'm an American. We'll fight as Americans. And he gave an example of what it was like to fight for interracial. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move now to the closing. And so at this time, I just want to, we'll have a little bit of moment of mindfulness. And so go ahead and breathe in through your nose. Breathe out through your mouth. Breathe in through your nose. Breathe out through your mouth. And I just want you to take a moment to just appreciate yourself. For our authors, each one of them were saying like, I don't know if I feel proud, but I hope you will take a moment to be proud of yourselves for what you've done and the work that you're doing. And for those of you who are here learning about Korean American stories, I hope you can take a moment to be proud of yourselves as well, because you're going to be filled with different ideas and thoughts that are going to be employed in the classroom. Each one of you are going to affect 200 lives just this year in fall 2022. I want you to think about one thing that you've learned from this seminar that you can apply for fall 2022. Is it including culture to include, to be more inclusive? Is it talking about magnanimity? Is it learning about resilience? Is it helping our students with their socio-emotional health and their mental health? Is it helping to grow resilience? And then I want you to think about one word that encapsulates how you're feeling right now. One word, how you're feeling. What is it that you're feeling right now? And I want you to put that one word into the public chat, please. The word that you're feeling. And Brian on saying he's feeling proud. Yoon Hee's feeling connected. Brian's feeling understood. Feeling understood. Wow, so many of us haven't felt understood, really. Brian on, inspired. Sarah Lee, connected. Mia, grateful. Yoon Choi, grateful. Gratitude. Kohei, hopeful. He finally. I agree. It's much too late. Joanne, inspired. Min-hee, enlightened. Sandra, community. Sam, encouraged. Sojin, hopeful. Misty, awareness. And Misty, I did see your question earlier, how it was a little bit difficult to log in. And I just want you to know that Principal Young-Suk Kim and Trustee Rosa, they have recorded this. They're recording this and this will go out. I hope also with the book list recommendations as well, so you can see it for yourself, but also for our students. I think they will want to see components of this. I hope you guys will timestamp I definitely want to share with my students this portion of the video or this portion of the video or this portion of the video. Hope you definitely log that. Grace Cho, learning never ends. Anna Kim, wondering. Kai, proud. And Brian on foundational. At this time, before I pass it to Nanmu Moon for the post-webinar survey link, would our authors or writer want to say anything to this group as well before we wrap this time up?
I'd like to say thank you so much for spending part of your day with us and for trying to learn a little something to bring back to your students. I really take to heart what EJ said about that one small thing a teacher can say to you once that stays with you for the rest of your life. And yeah, so grateful to be part of this panel. Thank you so much.
Principal Young-Soo Kim and Trustee Rosa, just want to thank you for your leadership in putting together this conference. Thank you so much for that. I now hand it to Nanmu Moon to lead us with the post-webinar survey.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jeff. We'd like to ask you all to respond to the post survey. Here is the link to the survey in the chat box. We appreciate it if you could do this survey. The first 40 people surveyed will receive a $10 gift card. Thank you for your participation.
Thank you so much, everyone. So we'll send out an email with this the link to recording and all the book list. Yeah. Thank you so much to all the panelists and then Dr. Jeff. It was wonderful to be with you all. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.